Before the war announces itself with gunfire or alarms, there are quieter movements. An ordinary street in occupied Europe settles into dusk. Cobblestones still hold the day's warmth. A bicycle rests against a wall. A shop window reflects nothing more dangerous than fading light. Nothing here suggests escape. And yet, this is where it begins. Before you drift off, take a moment to subscribe, but only if histories shaped by patience, silence, and unseen decisions are your kind of thing. And if you'd like, tell us where you're listening from, or which quiet moment stayed with you the longest. You're listening to Echoes of War. Beneath coats and loaves of bread, inside buttons, seams, and folded scraps of paper, a hidden war is already in motion. It is not fought with explosions or speeches. It unfolds through patience, through silence, through decisions made carefully and never spoken aloud. Routes exist that do not appear on maps. They pass through kitchens, churches, forests, and train platforms. They survive only as long as they remain unseen. This is the quiet world of MI9, a network built not to win battles, but to guide men home after everything has gone wrong. The problem of the captured airman. An aircraft falls behind enemy lines without ceremony. There is no trumpet to announce the moment when a mission becomes a problem, only the soft collapse of fabric as a parachute opens and the sudden intimacy of the ground rising to meet a man who was never meant to stand there. The sky moves on quickly. Engines fade. Clouds rearrange themselves. What remains is a body, a heartbeat, and a landscape that does not care which uniform has arrived upon it. This is where the war narrows. For the enemy, the solution is straightforward. Search patterns fan outward. Roads are sealed. Dogs follow the logic of scent. Capture is not personal. It is administrative, a matter of time and attention. For Britain, the question is slower and more uncomfortable. A pilot represents more than a downed aircraft. He carries training measured in years, experience earned in minutes of terror, and knowledge that cannot be taught quickly to anyone else. Losing him is not dramatic. It is cumulative. By 1940, the arithmetic of the air war made this impossible to ignore. Planes were falling faster than pilots could be replaced, and every descent behind occupied territory opened the same quiet corridor of uncertainty. What happens next? In the early months, the answer was usually nothing. Men hid when they could. They knocked on doors they hoped would open. Sometimes a stranger chose kindness without understanding the cost. Sometimes no one did. Escape existed only as accident, stitched together from chance and courage that had no name. War, however, has little patience for improvisation. Somewhere inside British intelligence, the idea took shape not as a flourish but as a necessity. If capture was likely, then survival could no longer be left to luck. It had to be anticipated, prepared, reduced to habits that would surface under stress without instruction. Out of this thinking emerged a department that worked in reverse. It did not plan victories. It planned contingencies. It asked not how to advance, but how to return. Its name was MI9. MI9 concerned itself with absence, with how to move without being seen, how to wait without leaving traces, how to exist briefly inside hostile space and then dissolve again. Its work rarely appeared in reports, and when it did, it was often as a footnote attached to someone else's success. Before airmen ever climbed into their cockpits, MI9 reached them through objects that looked ordinary enough to escape notice. A map printed on silk so it would not tear when folded small. A compass hidden inside a button, weightless until needed. Instructions taught aloud and memorized carefully, because paper was a liability. These items were not escape routes. They were permissions. They allowed a man to pause without panic, to move without broadcasting intention, to recognize help without speaking names. They acknowledged a truth the war rarely admitted. Survival depended as much on restraint as on action. MI9 understood that the moment choice disappeared, the war became something else entirely. Prison camps were full of men whose only mistake had been running out of options. So MI9 worked quietly, building not roads but possibilities. It assumed that aircraft would fall, that men would land alone in fields and forests, that the war would continue without pausing to notice them. And it prepared for the long, careful work of getting them home anyway. But maps and compasses were never enough on their own. Objects could suggest direction, but they could not open doors, silence questions, or turn occupied territory into temporary refuge. For that, something more fragile was required. Before there were lines, before there were names whispered between safe houses, there was only a single decision, made repeatedly and without witnesses, to help a stranger who should not be there. That decision would become the foundation of everything that followed. Help, when it first appeared, did not arrive as a system. It emerged as a moment, brief, unrecorded, and often irreversible, when an ordinary person decided that the presence of a stranger outweighed the danger of being seen. A door opened just long enough for a man to step inside. A cellar light stayed off when it should have been lit. A bowl of soup was placed on a table without questions attached. These gestures carried no ideology. They were not part of a movement. They were simply human responses to a war that had crossed into kitchens and back gardens without asking permission. For the downed airman, these moments were indistinguishable from luck. He could not know whether the next knock would bring food or a patrol, whether the voice answering his question would carry reassurance or accusation. Trust, in occupied Europe, was always provisional. MI9 watched these moments closely, not from the ground, but from a distance shaped by reports, debriefings, and patterns that began to repeat themselves. Certain regions proved more porous than others. Certain routes, river valleys, rail junctions, mountain passes, reappeared in accounts from men who had made it back. Civilians who helped once were more likely to help again, not because they were reckless, but because experience taught them how to disappear between acts. Gradually, fragments of mercy began to align. A farmer who hid one man learned where to send the next. A priest who passed messages learned which names could be trusted and which should never be spoken twice. A seamstress who repaired a jacket learned how to add a pocket that did not belong. None of these people saw the whole shape of what they were building, and that was part of its strength. MI9 did not attempt to control these networks. Control invited exposure. Instead, it listened, recorded, and quietly reinforced what already existed. Supplies were introduced without attribution. Instructions traveled backward through the system, carried by men who were returning home rather than entering danger. What emerged were not corridors but currents, escape lines that shifted with circumstance, bending around arrests, tightening when pressure increased, loosening again when the occupation looked elsewhere. The most successful of these lines shared a common feature. They were forgettable. They avoided drama. They relied on repetition rather than speed. Movement happened in increments small enough to feel safe until, suddenly, borders had been crossed and the air itself seemed to change. Spain lay beyond mountains that tested the body before they tested loyalty. Switzerland offered neutrality wrapped in surveillance. The sea, when it could be reached, carried its own arithmetic of risk. Each route demanded patience, and patience demanded silence. For the civilians involved, the cost was never abstract. Helping once made the second time more dangerous. Familiarity created patterns, and patterns attracted attention. Arrests did not always happen immediately. Sometimes they came months later, after habits had settled in and names had grown comfortable on the tongue. MI9 understood that every successful escape sharpened the risk for those left behind. This knowledge shaped how the department operated. Routes were wrested, then reactivated. Names were compartmentalized. Information was treated as something perishable. Even gratitude was managed carefully. Survivors were instructed to speak as little as possible about how they had returned, because words traveled faster than men. From the airman's perspective, the journey often felt improvised. Delays blurred together. Waiting became its own geography. Barns, attics, forest edges, spare rooms where clocks were covered and windows stayed shut. The sense of progress was rarely linear. Movement forward was followed by sudden stillness, sometimes for weeks at a time. What MI9 provided was not speed, but continuity. Each helper knew only enough to perform the next action. Each safe house existed independently, its survival not dependent on the fate of the others. If one section failed, the rest could remain intact, unseen and unconnected in any way that could be proven. This was not heroism as it would later be described. It was endurance applied quietly, one decision at a time, without any expectation of recognition. Many of those who participated would never know how many lives passed through their care, or whether the men they helped ever reached safety. For MI9, success was measured in absences, in empty chairs that should have been filled by prisoners, in pilots who returned to briefing rooms without explanations that could be written down. By the time the escape lines had names, Comet, Pat, Shelburne, they were already old, already scarred by compromise and loss. Their strength lay not in secrecy alone, but in restraint, in knowing when not to move, when not to speak, when to let the war pass overhead without responding. What had begun as individual acts of mercy had become a hidden infrastructure, flexible enough to survive pressure and quiet enough to remain invisible. And yet, for all its planning, MI9 never forgot the truth that governed everything it touched. Every escape, no matter how carefully prepared, still began the same way, with a single person deciding, in silence, to help a man who should not be there. Silk, ink, and the discipline of vanishing. Before an airman ever fell into enemy territory, MI9 had already begun preparing him for the moment when the sky would no longer be an option. This preparation did not resemble training in the usual sense. There were no drills loud enough to imitate pursuit, no simulations that could recreate the sudden intimacy of landing alone in a foreign field. What MI9 offered instead was familiarity. The objects introduced to airmen were deliberately unremarkable. They were meant to feel ordinary enough that fear would not reject them. A map printed on silk rather than paper. A compass hidden inside a uniform button. Currency reduced to fabric, folded small, sewn into seams that could pass inspection without comment. The silk map became the most recognizable of these tools, not because it promised escape, but because it survived handling. It did not tear when wet or crack when folded repeatedly. It made no sound when unfolded. Its ink was muted, its information dense but restrained, offering rivers, rail lines, and borders without instruction attached. The map was not meant to be studied at length. It was meant to be absorbed. Airmen were encouraged to look once, then put it away, letting the geography settle behind the eyes rather than under the fingers. A river could mark danger or opportunity. A rail junction could mean movement or delay. The map did not tell them what to do. It reminded them where they were. Smaller tools followed the same philosophy. Compasses were hidden in buttons because buttons were expected. Cards carried instructions disguised as games. Nothing announced itself as special. Nothing invited attention. Every object assumed that curiosity was the enemy. Training sessions were brief and intentionally undramatic. MI9 avoided spectacle. Instructors spoke plainly about what happened after a crash. The confusion of the first hours, the temptation to move too quickly, the danger of trusting the wrong voice simply because it sounded calm. Restraint was taught as a survival skill. Airmen were advised to avoid roads unless necessary, to move at dusk or dawn, to treat waiting as a form of progress rather than failure. They were warned that kindness could be real and dangerous at the same time, and that help often came with limits that should not be tested. Above all, MI9 emphasized that escape was not a race. Speed attracted attention. Stillness, when chosen deliberately, could erase it. Behind these instructions lay a quiet understanding MI9 rarely stated outright. The fewer decisions a man had to make under stress, the better his chances. Habits formed in calm could surface even when fear tried to drown them. The goal was never confidence. It was continuity. The same restraint MI9 taught to airmen shaped how escape lines were allowed to exist. Nothing was fixed for long. Routes were treated as living things, capable of fatigue, injury, and recovery. When pressure increased, movement slowed. When attention drifted elsewhere, lines loosened again, resuming their quiet work without announcement. MI9 avoided the temptation to harden these routes into rigid corridors. A single dependable path invited pattern recognition, and pattern recognition invited collapse. Instead, escape lines were encouraged to fragment, to rely on alternatives that could be activated or abandoned without explanation. Redundancy was survival. Information moved backward as often as it moved forward. Returned airmen were not celebrated immediately. They were listened to. Their journeys were broken down into sequences of waiting and movement, each step examined not for heroics, but for friction. Where did fear spike? Where did trust fail? Which moments felt safest, and which only appeared so in hindsight? These debriefings shaped everything that followed. Supplies were adjusted. Instructions were shortened. Entire sections of routes were rested, sometimes permanently. MI9 learned to accept loss without trying to correct it too quickly. A compromised safe house was not a failure. It was a warning. A delayed crossing was not inefficiency. It was discretion. The discipline of vanishing required patience from everyone involved. For civilians, this patience came at a cost that was rarely acknowledged aloud. Helping once altered the shape of daily life forever after. Familiarity bred risk. Neighbors noticed patterns. The same bicycle passing too often. The same curtain drawn at the wrong hour. Silence had to be practiced constantly, even when nothing seemed to be happening. MI9 understood that these people could not be managed like assets. They could only be respected. Support arrived quietly, often without explanation. Money changed hands without records. Materials appeared where they were needed and vanished just as easily. Gratitude, when expressed at all, was understated. Attention was the one currency never spent. For the men moving along the lines, the experience often felt disjointed. Days passed without progress. Movement came in short bursts, sometimes only a few streets at a time. Waiting rooms blurred together. Barns, spare bedrooms, back rooms of shops that smelled of soap or flour or damp wool. What held these journeys together was not speed, but rhythm. Each segment ended before exhaustion invited mistakes. Each pause was long enough for danger to pass, but short enough to keep resolve intact. Escape, when successful, rarely announced itself with clarity. Borders were crossed without ceremony. Neutral ground revealed itself slowly, often through the absence of tension rather than the presence of relief. MI9 never promised certainty. It promised that someone had thought about this moment before it arrived. That promise mattered. In a war defined by sudden violence and irreversible decisions, the escape lines offered a different model of endurance. One built on hesitation, adjustment, and the refusal to rush toward resolution. Their success depended not on brilliance, but on humility, the willingness to accept that survival required patience more often than courage. Over time, names attached themselves to these routes. Comet, Pat, Shelburne. They would later be spoken with reverence, simplified into stories that fit comfortably inside memory. But while they operated, they remained deliberately unfinished, changing shape whenever attention grew too sharp. MI9 measured success in absences, in empty bunks where prisoners should have been, in briefings resumed without explanation, in men returned quietly to duty, carrying nothing outward to suggest how they had come back. And always, beneath the planning and the objects and the routes, the same fragile truth remained intact. Every escape still depended on a human decision made in silence. Every line survived only as long as it remained forgettable. Names that could not be written, the work of memory. MI9 understood early that paper was a liability. Anything written could be taken. Anything taken could be read. And anything read could be turned, patiently and without urgency, into a list of names that did not yet know they were already endangered. So MI9 taught memory. Not heroic memory, not feats of recall meant to impress, but practical memory, the kind that survives fatigue, fear, and repetition. Airmen were trained to carry information the way civilians carried habits, lightly, without conscious effort, and ready to be discarded when necessary. Names were rarely shared in full. Addresses were broken into fragments. Instructions arrived as sequences rather than explanations. A phrase remembered at the right moment could replace a document entirely. A mistake made quietly could still be corrected. A mistake written down could not. This approach shaped how escape lines spoke to one another. Messages passed through mouths rather than hands whenever possible. When paper was unavoidable, it carried nothing complete enough to betray a whole network. A town without a street. A time without a date. A name without a face. Meaning was assembled only at the moment it was needed, and then allowed to dissolve again. MI9 encouraged this fragmentation deliberately. It made betrayal inefficient. For those involved, the effect was disorienting. Helpers often knew exactly what to do next, but not why. They learned to trust procedure over explanation, to accept that clarity was dangerous. Curiosity became something to manage rather than indulge. This discipline extended to the airmen themselves. They were taught that remembering too much could be as risky as remembering too little. Names, once spoken, carried weight. Faces, once described, could be reconstructed. Silence was not emptiness. It was a form of protection. If captured, the goal was not defiance, but consistency. Stories were kept simple enough to survive repetition. Details were avoided not because they were secret, but because they created hooks. MI9 trained men to understand that interrogations did not seek truth immediately. They sought texture, variations in tone, hesitation, contradiction. Memory, when overused, betrayed itself. So memory was rationed. This approach required humility. It asked people to accept that they were not the center of the story they were participating in, that their role mattered precisely because it remained incomplete. Many helpers would never know how close they came to collapse, or how many lives depended on their restraint. MI9 never framed this as sacrifice. It framed it as necessity. Over time, this culture of partial knowledge became one of the escape line's greatest strengths. When arrests occurred, and they always did, the damage rarely spread far. What one person knew could not unravel what another had never been told. The result was a network that survived not through secrecy alone, but through deliberate forgetfulness. Names passed through it without settling. Routes shifted without explanation. Success left no trace that could be followed backward. The war moved overhead, loud and visible, while beneath it a quieter system learned how to remain unfinished. And yet, even this careful architecture depended on something more fragile than memory. It depended on trust. Not trust in people as individuals, but trust in a structure that asked everyone involved to know less than they wanted to. Trust under pressure. Trust, in occupied Europe, was never abstract. It was tested daily by fatigue, fear, and the simple human need to explain oneself. MI9 understood that the greatest threat to silence was not brutality alone, but familiarity, the slow erosion that comes from repeated contact and the desire to be understood. The escape lines were designed to make trust impersonal. Helpers trusted procedures more than people. They followed instructions that arrived without justification and passed on strangers without learning their stories. This was not coldness. It was a discipline learned through loss. Every additional detail carried forward increased the surface area of risk. MI9 reinforced this discipline by limiting visibility even within the network. Couriers did not know who sheltered men before them, or where those men would go next. A single journey might involve a dozen hands, none of which could describe the whole. When arrests occurred, this fragmentation mattered. A captured helper could reveal what they knew, and what they knew would end there. Interrogations often unfolded slowly, designed to encourage narrative, stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling. MI9 trained networks resisted this by offering little to elaborate on. Silence denied interrogators the texture they needed to expand suspicion outward. This did not make the pressure survivable. It made it containable. Under interrogation, airmen faced a different calculus. They carried more knowledge, even when trained to limit it. MI9 instructed them not to perform heroics, not to attempt clever deception under stress. The aim was consistency, not brilliance. A simple story repeated without ornament endured longer than an elaborate lie. Trust, here, meant trusting the system to outlast the moment. Many did not know if the people who helped them were still free, or whether their own survival had increased the danger for those left behind. This uncertainty was part of the burden MI9 accepted quietly. Success was measured without ceremony. Failure was absorbed without public accounting. Over time, the networks developed a kind of emotional economy. Gratitude was felt but rarely expressed. Bonds formed briefly, then dissolved. Memory was allowed to fade where it could not be preserved safely. This was not ingratitude. It was maintenance. MI9 never pretended this came without cost. People disappeared. Some returned changed. Others never returned at all. The system endured because it expected loss and refused to chase explanations that would expose more lives. Trust was placed not in outcomes, but in process, the belief that restraint today protected someone tomorrow. This approach often appeared inhumane to those outside it. But within the occupied landscape, where visibility invited violence, it proved resilient. The escape lines did not survive because they were perfect. They survived because they were incomplete. Names could not be written. Stories could not be finished. Trust existed not as intimacy, but as shared restraint. and in that restraint, the network held its shape long enough for men to pass through it and vanish from sight. When silence failed, the cost of being seen. No network, however careful, remained untouched by exposure. Silence could be practiced, routines refined, knowledge rationed, but occupation had a way of pressing itself into the smallest gaps, listening patiently for what repeated itself too often. Arrests rarely arrived as storms. They came as adjustments. A door that opened a little too quickly. A neighbor who watched without appearing to. A routine that felt safe because it had not yet been punished. MI9 understood that failure most often followed familiarity, not recklessness. When a line was compromised, the damage unfolded unevenly. Some sections collapsed immediately. Others continued for weeks, unaware that attention had shifted toward them. The danger of visibility was not that it announced itself, but that it lingered quietly, allowing trust to continue where caution should have replaced it. MI9's response to exposure was deliberately restrained. There were no attempts to rescue entire networks at once, no dramatic extractions that would draw more eyes. Routes were wrested, movement slowed, messages shortened or stopped altogether. The goal was not recovery, but containment. This restraint often felt cruel to those inside the system. Helpers who sensed danger were sometimes instructed to wait rather than flee. Airmen nearing safety were delayed without explanation. These decisions were not made lightly, but they were made with a broader horizon in mind, protecting the many at the expense of the few moments of certainty. Interrogation intensified when silence failed. Captured helpers faced pressure designed to outlast resolve rather than overwhelm it. The aim was not confession in a single moment, but erosion, small admissions gathered over time, shaped into patterns. MI9 trained networks resisted this not through defiance, but through absence. There was little to extract because little had been given. For airmen, the failure of silence carried a different weight. Capture meant the end of movement and the beginning of endurance. The habits learned before flight became essential: repetition, consistency, refusal to embellish. The temptation to explain, to justify oneself to an authority that demanded clarity, had to be resisted. MI9 had prepared them for this moment as well. Training emphasized that interrogators sought narrative more than truth. Contradiction created leverage. Precision created targets. Simplicity, sustained over time, created fatigue in the questioner rather than the prisoner. Even so, the cost of failure was real. Some lines never recovered. Some helpers vanished into prisons and camps, whose names would later carry their own weight. Others survived long enough to see the war end, carrying with them the quiet knowledge that what they had done could not be spoken about safely, even afterward. MI9 recorded these losses without ceremony. Reports noted routes, compromised. Names were marked inactive. New paths were explored cautiously. The work continued not because the cost was acceptable, but because stopping would expose even more people to danger. Silence, once broken, could not be repaired. It could only be replaced. And so MI9 adapted again, learning not only how to remain unseen, but how to retreat without leaving evidence behind. Failure became another condition to plan for, another shape the war could take. The escape lines survived not because they avoided being seen forever, but because they learned how to disappear again when visibility became unavoidable. Learning how to withdraw. When a line failed, the instinct to explain had to be resisted. Explanation created shape. Shape created pattern. Pattern invited pursuit. MI9 understood that withdrawal, to be effective, had to be as quiet as the work that preceded it. Routes were not announced as closed. They simply thinned. Messages slowed, then stopped. Safe houses returned to their former lives without ceremony, as if nothing unusual had ever passed through their doors. The success of withdrawal depended on making absence look natural. This was often the most difficult phase for those involved. People who had grown accustomed to purpose found themselves instructed to wait indefinitely. Others were told to destroy materials they had protected for months, sometimes years. Trust was not withdrawn, but redirected, away from action toward stillness. MI9 treated withdrawal as an active discipline. Supplies were reduced rather than removed. Contacts were spaced farther apart. New helpers were not recruited. The aim was not to erase what had existed, but to let it dissolve into the background of daily life before attention could settle on it again. For airmen caught inside a collapsing line, the experience could feel like abandonment. Progress halted. Plans evaporated. Waiting extended without explanation. MI9 accepted this discomfort as unavoidable. Movement under pressure was more dangerous than delay under uncertainty. Some men were instructed to surrender deliberately, choosing imprisonment over continued exposure of civilians. This decision, rarely spoken of afterward, reflected the department's underlying ethic. Survival could not come at unlimited cost to others. For helpers, survival after collapse carried its own weight. Those not arrested returned to ordinary routines carrying extraordinary memories they could not share. Familiar places felt altered by what they had concealed. Silence became not just a tactic, but a habit that followed them long after the war had moved on. MI9 did not attempt to preserve these experiences. There were no medals for those who waited when they wanted to run, no citations for the decision not to act. The department recorded withdrawals in neutral language and moved forward. Its responsibility lay with continuity, not commemoration. Over time, new lines emerged where old ones had faded. Geography shifted. Pressure redistributed itself. The work resumed quietly, informed by what had failed before. MI9's greatest strength lay not in preventing collapse, but in ensuring that collapse did not spread. This required a particular kind of restraint, one that accepted partial loss as preferable to total exposure. By the later years of the war, MI9 had learned to recognize the early signs of danger more quickly. Patterns that once took months to identify were now noticed in weeks. Withdrawal became faster, more fluid, less disruptive to those involved. Silence, once broken, could not be restored. But absence could be managed. The escape lines survived the war not because they were unbroken, but because they were willing to let themselves fade whenever attention grew too sharp. Their success lay in knowing when to vanish, and trusting that invisibility, once reclaimed, could still protect those who remained. Those who walked between worlds, couriers and the weight of passing through. Not everyone who served the escape lines was meant to remain still. Some people were chosen precisely because they could move, because movement came naturally to them, and because their presence did not immediately attract attention. Couriers occupied this space between visibility and invisibility. They carried no uniforms and rarely carried documents that could survive inspection. Their authority rested not in rank, but in familiarity. They knew which trains to board without hesitation, which cafes tolerated lingering, which streets could be crossed without being remembered. Their work relied on timing more than strength. MI9 understood that these individuals carried a different kind of risk. Movement created exposure. Repetition created patterns. Every journey added to the chance that someone would notice the same face too often, the same route taken with too much confidence. Couriers learned to fracture their routines deliberately, choosing inefficiency over recognition. Their loads were light by design. Messages were short, often incomplete. Objects were chosen for plausibility rather than importance. A parcel might contain nothing more than fabric or soap, its true value existing only in who expected it to arrive. If stopped, there was little to explain and nothing worth defending. Couriers learned to inhabit the ordinary. They dressed to blend, adopted postures that did not hurry or linger, and spoke only when silence would attract attention. They practiced forgetting destinations even as they approached them, trusting that the body would arrive where the mind refused to linger. For MI9, couriers were not heroes. They were connective tissue. They allowed fragmented networks to remain functional without becoming centralized. They carried instructions backward as often as forward, ensuring that experience traveled without requiring explanation. Their reports shaped how routes evolved, how risks were reassessed, how pressure was redistributed. This work demanded a particular kind of endurance. Unlike those who waited in safe houses or hid in fixed positions, couriers were exposed continuously. They slept in unfamiliar places, ate when opportunities appeared, and learned to read danger in the smallest details. A conductor's glance, a question asked twice, a platform that felt too orderly. Fear, for them, was not an event. It was a companion. MI9 did not ask couriers to eliminate this fear. It asked them to manage it, to let it sharpen awareness without dictating movement. Mistakes were expected. Survival depended on whether those mistakes created patterns. Some couriers worked for months. Others disappeared quickly. A few would later be remembered by name. Most would not. What unified them was not ideology, but adaptability. They learned to pass through lives without disturbing them, to carry meaning without explanation, to leave places as if they had never arrived. Their success lay not in what they accomplished, but in how little trace they left behind. And yet, even this careful movement depended on something more fragile than discipline. It depended on the willingness of strangers to accept a passing presence without asking too much, and on the courier's ability to sense when it was time to move on. Living without leaving marks. Movement, sustained long enough, reshapes the person who carries it. Couriers learned this not as a lesson, but as an accumulation, of nights spent in unfamiliar rooms, of conversations abandoned halfway, of names used once and then set aside forever. Identity became something provisional. Names were chosen for convenience rather than meaning. Papers, when carried at all, reflected lives that could be entered and exited without explanation. Over time, the distinction between what was assumed and what was real grew thin. The danger was not confusion, but attachment to a version of oneself that could not be maintained safely. MI9 understood this erosion and planned around it. Couriers were rotated when possible. Routes were altered not only for security, but to interrupt habit. Familiarity, once it became comforting, was treated as a warning sign. The goal was not efficiency, but survivability. Fatigue presented itself quietly. There were no single moments when the weight became unbearable. Instead, resolve thinned gradually. Attention wavered. Small risks began to feel acceptable. MI9 monitored this through absence as much as presence. Missed timings, shortened reports, requests that arrived slightly later than expected. When withdrawal was necessary, it was rarely explained. Couriers were instructed to stop moving without being told why. Some were absorbed into other roles. Others were asked to wait until the war ended, carrying knowledge they could not release. For people defined by motion, stillness required its own discipline. The long-term cost of this work rarely appeared in records. After the war, some couriers returned easily to ordinary life. Others found that stillness no longer fit. Silence, once practiced as protection, became habitual. Stories remained unfinished because finishing them felt dangerous, even when danger had passed. MI9 did not attempt to resolve this. The department's responsibility ended with survival. What followed belonged to individuals who had learned to move through the world without leaving marks, and who now had to relearn how to be seen without consequence. For the escape lines, the courier's role remained essential until the final months of the war. Even as front lines shifted and liberation approached, movement remained risky. Familiar routes still collapsed without warning. Trust still required careful calibration. Couriers continued to walk between worlds until there was only one world left to walk in. Their work concluded without ceremony. No final deliveries. No clear ending. Just a gradual reduction in need, as borders reopened and uniforms reappeared where civilians had carried the weight alone. The skills that once ensured survival faded back into habit, then memory. What remained was a quiet understanding shared by those who had passed through so many lives without disturbing them. Sometimes, survival depends not on being remembered, but on leaving nothing behind. The long way home, after the ground rises. The moment after landing rarely felt dramatic. There was no clear dividing line between danger and safety, only the realization that the sky, so recently a source of threat and motion, had become unreachable. What followed was orphan stillness. Airmen learned quickly that movement without purpose drew attention. The first hours were spent listening, to the countryside settling again, to voices carried by wind, to the absence or presence of pursuit. Training surfaced not as instruction, but as habit, hands checking pockets, silk folded away, compass weight confirmed without looking. MI9 had prepared them for this pause. They were taught that the urge to flee immediately was natural and dangerous. Roads invited questions. Speed suggested guilt. Waiting, when chosen deliberately, could dissolve urgency on the other side as well. When movement began, it was incremental. A hedgerow crossed at dusk. A field skirted rather than traversed. Villages observed from distance before being entered, if they were entered at all. Airmen learned to read the landscape not for beauty, but for permission, where they might pass without leaving an impression. Hunger and fatigue arrived early. Rations ran out quickly. Water was not always safe. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the need to listen rather than rest. MI9's instructions did not eliminate these pressures. They offered ways to prioritize under them. Warmth mattered more than distance. Concealment mattered more than direction. The first contact with civilians often arrived unexpectedly. A figure in a field who did not turn away. A door opened cautiously, then held open just long enough. Language barriers mattered less than posture. The wrong question could close a conversation instantly. The right silence could extend it. Airmen learned that trust was not requested. It was offered indirectly. MI9's training emphasized this restraint. Help, when genuine, revealed itself without prompting. When it did not, the safest response was to withdraw without explanation. Survival depended on reading not only what was said, but what was avoided. As days passed, the sense of progress became abstract. Maps showed distance, but terrain rewrote it constantly. A kilometer through open fields felt longer than 10 through woods. Borders existed on paper long before they appeared in experience. Neutrality, when reached, did not always feel immediate. The body took time to understand that pursuit had ended. Throughout this process, MI9's influence remained present without being visible. The tools provided did not solve problems. They framed them. They reduced choices to manageable sets, allowing airmen to act without overthinking under strain. Familiar objects anchored attention when fear threatened to scatter it. The journey home, when it began at all, was never straight. It unfolded as a series of short-term survivals, each one small enough to feel provisional, each one necessary to reach the next. MI9 understood that this was the only kind of journey the occupied landscape would allow, and so the long way home was accepted not as a detour, but as the path itself. When movement ended. Not every journey continued forward. For some, the long way home narrowed until movement itself became the risk. Airmen learned to recognize this moment gradually. Signs appeared in the environment before they registered as danger, roads that felt watched, questions asked with too much care, a village that grew quiet too quickly. MI9 had warned them that escape was not a test of persistence. It was a test of judgment. Sometimes, stopping was the safest choice. Deliberate surrender was never framed as failure. It was a calculation made when continued movement threatened to expose those who helped, or when the weight of pursuit grew too heavy to manage without leaving a trail. Prison camps, harsh as they were, offered a form of containment that wandering no longer could. MI9 prepared airmen for this possibility without apology. They were instructed on how to surrender without providing momentum to the enemy. Hands raised early. Speech limited. Stories kept simple and consistent. The goal was not dignity, but containment, ensuring that capture ended a journey rather than extending its danger outward. For those who surrendered, time reshaped itself. Days slowed into routine. Movement was replaced by endurance. Survival became an exercise in managing expectation rather than terrain. The training MI9 provided still applied, though differently. Silence mattered. Consistency mattered. Curiosity remained something to avoid. Even within captivity, escape lines continued to operate indirectly. Information moved quietly between camps and beyond them. Opportunities were noted and deferred. Not every prisoner was meant to escape. Some were better suited to remain where they were, preserving others' chances by not adding pressure to systems already stretched thin. MI9 understood that heroics could be counterproductive. Successful escapes from camps inspired hope, but they also inspired attention. The decision to act or wait was never universal. It depended on timing, geography, and the condition of those who would be asked to help. Patience, once again, became a form of courage. For airmen who remained on the move, the moment when movement ended could arrive without warning. A border crossed without celebration. A door closed behind them and remained closed. Neutral ground announced itself quietly, often through the absence of urgency rather than the presence of safety. The body took time to understand that it was no longer being hunted. Return did not always feel like relief. Some men arrived back among uniforms and briefings carrying experiences that resisted explanation. They were asked to describe routes they could not name, helpers they were instructed not to remember, choices that had kept them alive by remaining invisible. MI9 absorbed these accounts carefully. Debriefings focused on friction rather than drama, where fear spiked, where waiting failed, where silence broke. Each journey, successful or not, became material for adjustment rather than celebration. The long way home ended not with triumph, but with continuity. Some men flew again. Others did not. All carried forward the knowledge that survival had depended less on speed or strength than on restraint, the willingness to stop when stopping was safer, to wait when waiting preserved others, to disappear when visibility threatened to harm. MI9's work concluded quietly, as it had begun. Journeys ended without ceremony. Tools were returned or forgotten. Routes faded as the war moved on. What remained were absences that told their own story, men who returned when they should not have been able to, and civilians who survived because someone chose not to push farther. The long way home was never meant to be heroic. It was meant to be survivable. The work that could not be celebrated, success measured in silence. MI9 never counted victories the way other departments did. There were no territories taken, no enemy formations broken, no moments that lent themselves to photographs or speeches. Its successes appeared only as gaps, in places where absence quietly replaced expectation. A pilot returned to duty without explanation. A name never appeared on a prisoner list. A camp remained less crowded than it should have been. These were not outcomes that invited applause. Recognition posed a risk MI9 could not afford. Every public acknowledgement drew attention toward methods that depended on remaining forgettable. The department understood that celebration created questions, and questions created patterns that could be followed backward through people who had survived only because no one was looking too closely. So MI9 practiced restraint even in success. Reports were written sparsely. Language was neutral. Details that might satisfy curiosity were deliberately omitted. The emphasis remained on procedure rather than individuals, on continuity rather than accomplishment. This approach extended to those who benefited most directly from the escape lines. Airmen who returned were often instructed to say very little about how they had done so, not because their stories lacked value, but because value could be dangerous. Names were protected by being left unspoken. Places were reduced to regions or omitted entirely. Gratitude, when expressed, was folded inward. MI9 was careful not to create heroes where anonymity was safer. This did not mean that sacrifice went unnoticed internally. The department tracked losses carefully, recording compromised routes, arrested helpers, and networks that faded under pressure. These records existed not to honor, but to inform. Memory, once again, was used sparingly. Over time, the quiet accumulation of success created its own tension. As the war progressed and Allied momentum shifted, pressure grew to expand operations, to move faster, to extract more men before conditions changed again. MI9 resisted this instinct. Speed increased risk. Expansion invited visibility. The department chose durability over scale. This decision often placed it at odds with those who measured success differently. Requests arrived to prioritize certain individuals, certain missions, certain outcomes. MI9 evaluated these requests cautiously, weighing them not against urgency, but against the strain they placed on the invisible infrastructure supporting them. Not every opportunity was taken. Not every risk was accepted. Silence was treated as a resource. To spend it carelessly would have been to endanger those whose survival depended on being overlooked. MI9's ethic remained consistent. If an action threatened to illuminate the network itself, it was deferred or abandoned, regardless of potential gain. In this way, the department's greatest achievement was also its least visible. It built a system that allowed men to pass through occupied Europe without leaving a trail that could be traced afterward. It accepted that many of those who made this possible would never be known beyond a small circle of necessity, and it understood that the war would eventually end without offering closure to those whose work had depended on remaining unfinished. Success, for MI9, was not something to be declared. It was something to be preserved by staying quiet. After the silence lifted. When the war ended, the work did not announce itself. There were no ceremonies waiting for the routes that had faded, no parades for the networks that had survived by remaining unseen. Liberation brought noise back into the streets, but the quiet systems that had carried men home were expected to dissolve without comment. MI9 complied. Files were closed carefully. Names remained protected. Methods were folded away under classifications that would outlast the urgency that created them. The department understood that peace did not automatically make visibility safe. Curiosity persisted. So did the consequences of satisfying it. For those who had worked within the escape lines, the transition was uneven. Some returned to ordinary lives with relief, glad to release a vigilance that had shaped every decision. Others found that stillness felt unfamiliar. Silence, once practiced deliberately, had become habit. Stories remained incomplete not because they were forgotten, but because finishing them felt unnecessary or dangerous. MI9 offered little guidance here. Its responsibility had always ended at survival. What followed belonged to individuals who had learned to live without recognition, and who now faced a world eager to explain the war in cleaner terms than it had ever been experienced. Years passed before fragments of the story emerged publicly. Histories focused on famous lines and dramatic rescues, compressing years of restraint into narratives that fit comfortably on pages and screens. Names were attached where they could be verified. Others remained absent, not because they were unimportant, but because verification itself would have betrayed the principles that kept them alive. MI9 watched this process without correction. The department understood that no public account could fully capture a system designed to resist documentation. Silence had been a method. It remained a legacy. Some recognition arrived eventually, measured and cautious. Medals were awarded to a few. Mentions appeared in memoirs that spoke around details rather than through them. Reunions occurred quietly, shaped more by shared understanding than by shared stories. Gratitude existed, but it was often wordless. For many civilians who had helped, acknowledgement never came. Their reward lay in what did not happen, in arrests avoided, in children raised without knowing how close their homes had come to danger, in lives that continued without interruption. MI9 had always understood that this was the most meaningful outcome it could offer. The escape lines did not end with a final journey or a last crossing. They faded as the conditions that required them disappeared. Borders reopened. Uniforms returned to the roads. Movement no longer needed to be hidden. What had once been extraordinary became unnecessary. What remained were absences that told their own story. Men who returned when they should not have been able to. Names missing from lists where they were expected to appear. A quiet understanding, shared by those who had participated, that some forms of courage could not survive attention. MI9's legacy was never meant to be visible. It existed in the spaces between records, in the gaps where explanation stopped, in the knowledge that survival, in a war built on exposure, sometimes depended on the discipline of remaining unseen. When the ground changed, liberation without relief. Liberation did not arrive all at once. It came unevenly, advancing in sections, retreating in places, leaving behind pockets of danger that did not match the direction of the front. For MI9 and the escape lines, this created a new kind of uncertainty. The rules that had governed survival under occupation began to blur. Areas once considered hostile shifted suddenly into Allied control. Others, assumed safe by proximity, remained watched. Familiar routes collapsed not from exposure, but from irrelevance. The danger was no longer only being seen, it was being misread. MI9 understood that this transition required as much restraint as the work that preceded it. Escape lines were not dismantled immediately. Too many men still fell behind advancing fronts. Too many regions existed in a half-state, neither fully occupied nor truly free. Movement, though less hidden, still demanded caution. Civilians who had learned to hide now had to learn when it was safe to stop hiding. This was not intuitive. Habits formed under danger did not dissolve simply because uniforms changed. Doors still closed automatically. Silence still arrived before speech. Trust, once rationed, did not expand easily. MI9 accounted for this hesitation. Instructions shifted subtly, emphasizing verification over assumption. Allies were identified carefully. New authorities were treated with the same restraint once reserved for occupiers. The war had taught too many lessons about appearances to abandon skepticism quickly. For airmen and escapees, liberation often felt anticlimactic. There was no single moment when fear switched off. The absence of pursuit took time to register. Even after reaching Allied lines, many remained alert, waiting for danger that no longer arrived. The body lagged behind circumstance. MI9 saw this as continuity rather than failure. The systems built for invisibility proved adaptable even when invisibility was no longer required. What mattered was not hiding itself, but the discipline that supported it, the ability to move cautiously, to verify before trusting, to accept delay without panic. As the front advanced, MI9 began the careful process of disengagement. Routes were allowed to lapse naturally. Contacts were thanked without explanation. Materials were destroyed or returned to ordinary use. The aim was not to erase the past, but to prevent it from becoming visible through lingering structures. Liberation simplified some dangers while complicating others. New governments formed. Old collaborators attempted to disappear. Civilians who had helped the escape lines found themselves navigating a world suddenly eager for clarity, for explanations that did not account for years spent surviving quietly. MI9 avoided involvement here. Its mandate remained narrow. It had never been responsible for justice or memory, only for survival. As liberation expanded, that responsibility diminished, but it did not vanish overnight. The ground had changed. The habits had not. And so MI9 continued, briefly, to operate in the space between what the war had been and what it was becoming, guiding men through a landscape where danger no longer looked the way it used to, and where freedom, though present, still required careful handling. The quiet end of necessity. As liberation advanced, MI9 faced a problem it had never been designed to solve. Its work depended on danger. Without danger, its methods risked becoming visible artifacts, structures that no longer needed to exist, but could still draw attention if left standing. Disbandment, like everything MI9 had done, required restraint. The department did not issue announcements or closing dates. Routes were allowed to empty rather than end. Couriers stopped moving without being told why. Safe houses returned to ordinary use, their walls holding memories that no longer needed to be protected by silence. For many involved, this absence of closure felt unsettling. Years of vigilance had trained people to expect consequences. The sudden lack of urgency did not bring immediate relief. It brought uncertainty. Without danger to organize behavior, habits drifted without direction. MI9 recognized this and moved slowly. Files were closed gradually. Names remained protected. Reports were archived with care, their language deliberately plain. The aim was not to preserve achievement, but to prevent curiosity from assembling fragments into patterns that could expose those who had survived by remaining unremarkable. For civilians, the end of necessity arrived unevenly. Some welcomed the return of ordinary life with relief. Others found that the skills learned under occupation, listening more than speaking, watching rather than acting, did not dissolve easily. Silence, once practiced deliberately, lingered. MI9 did not attempt to guide this transition. Its authority ended where danger ended. What followed belonged to people who had learned to exist without being seen, and who now had to relearn how to inhabit a visible world without consequence. For airmen who returned through MI9's system, the end came without ceremony. They re-entered service or civilian life carrying experiences that resisted description. Routes could not be drawn. Helpers could not be named. Survival felt incomplete without a story that could be told safely. MI9 accepted this incompleteness. The department had never promised meaning. It had promised continuity. With liberation, that promise expired quietly, leaving behind absences rather than monuments. The escape lines faded not because they failed, but because they were no longer required. Borders reopened. Uniforms replaced civilians on the roads. Movement stopped needing to be hidden. What had once been extraordinary returned to ordinary space without explanation. What remained were traces too subtle to mark. A house that had once closed its door carefully now opened it without thinking. A road crossed without counting footsteps. A silence broken without consequence. These were not symbols of victory, but of release. MI9's work ended the way it had begun, without announcement, without recognition, and without leaving anything behind that could be followed. What remained unsaid? Scale without spectacle. MI9 never spoke easily about numbers. Counting suggested certainty, and certainty suggested control, two things the department never fully possessed. Still, the scale of what had occurred could not be ignored entirely. Thousands of men were assisted, directly or indirectly, by the systems MI9 helped sustain. Each journey differed. Some ended in neutral countries. Others ended in camps. Many ended quietly back at briefing tables where explanations were deliberately thin. Together, they formed a pattern that resisted compression into a single account. What mattered was not the total, but the method. MI9's work did not hinge on singular moments of brilliance. It depended on repetition, on the careful application of restraint across years, across borders, across people who would never meet. The absence of spectacle was not incidental. It was the mechanism that made endurance possible. This absence shaped how the story survived. Without dramatic climaxes to anchor memory, MI9's work faded easily beside more visible narratives of war. Battles could be mapped. Leaders could be named. Dates could be circled. Escape, by contrast, resisted display. It unfolded in kitchens and fields and spare rooms whose ordinariness protected them. MI9 understood this trade-off. Visibility might have brought recognition. It also would have destroyed the conditions that made survival possible. The department accepted obscurity not as a failure of narrative, but as a requirement of function. Ethically, this position was never comfortable. MI9 operated within compromises that rarely appeared in official language. Decisions were made that favored containment over rescue, delay over momentum, silence over explanation. These choices saved lives while leaving others exposed. The calculus was imperfect, shaped by information that was always incomplete. The department did not claim moral clarity. It claimed responsibility. This distinction mattered. MI9's leaders understood that to frame their work as heroic would be dishonest. Heroism implied choice without consequence. The reality was narrower. Every action closed off other possibilities. Every success carried unseen costs borne by those who remained anonymous. Civilians paid the heaviest price. Many lived under suspicion long after the war ended. their pasts indistinguishable from collaboration in a world eager to assign blame cleanly. MI9 could not protect them from memory or from the absence of it. Silence, once necessary, sometimes became a burden without audience. Yet for all of this, the system endured, not because it was virtuous, but because it was adaptive. It absorbed failure, redistributed risk, and accepted incompleteness as a condition rather than an obstacle. MI9's ethics were procedural rather than declarative, embedded in habits rather than statements. As the war receded, these habits dissolved into the background. What remained was not a ledger of achievements, but a shape, a way of approaching survival that valued restraint over drama, patience over speed, and invisibility over acknowledgement. This shape did not demand remembrance. It accepted forgetting as part of its design. Survival without a monument. When wars end, they usually leave markers behind. Stone names the fallen. Dates fix themselves into memory. Stories gather around places where something decisive can be pointed to and explained. MI9 left no such markers. Its work concluded without a location that could be visited, without an action that could be reenacted safely. The escape lines did not end in victory. They ended in irrelevance. When danger receded, they simply stopped being necessary, and the structures that supported them faded into ordinary life. This absence was not accidental. MI9 had been built to disappear. Its success depended on the ability to withdraw without residue, to leave behind nothing that could be traced forward or backward. The department accepted that this would also erase its place in the war's public memory. For those who had passed through its systems, the legacy was quieter. Men returned to lives interrupted, carrying experiences that resisted narrative. They knew routes that no longer existed, relied on people whose names could not be spoken, and survived because of decisions that would never be recorded fully. The urge to explain was often met with the realization that explanation itself would distort what had occurred. Civilians who had helped carried an even heavier silence. Their courage had depended on ordinariness. To describe it later would have altered its meaning. Many chose never to speak about what they had done, not out of fear, but out of fidelity to the discipline that had kept others alive. MI9 never asked them to remember. It asked them to endure. As years passed, fragments of the story surfaced in memoirs, archives, and cautious histories. Names appeared selectively. Routes were mapped after the fact, stripped of the hesitation and uncertainty that had defined them. These accounts were not wrong. They were incomplete by necessity. MI9 accepted this incompleteness as its final condition. The department's legacy was not meant to instruct or inspire in the conventional sense. It offered no slogans, no doctrines that could be applied elsewhere without distortion. Its lessons were situational, bound to a war where visibility equaled danger and restraint equaled survival. What it demonstrated, instead, was a way of thinking under pressure. That sometimes the most effective response is not action, but delay. That sometimes survival depends not on being remembered, but on being forgotten. That some forms of courage exist only when they refuse attention. In the end, MI9 did not change the outcome of the war by force. It altered the shape of survival within it. Men returned who would otherwise have vanished. Lives continued in houses that might have been emptied. The war passed overhead, loud and visible, while beneath it a quieter effort ensured that disappearance was not always final. No monument marks this work, but in the spaces where absence replaced loss, its influence remains, unspoken, unfinished, and deliberately unseen. Aftermath, where silence settled. When the last routes fell quiet, Nothing replaced them. There was no ceremony to mark the moment when escape was no longer required. No final crossing to commemorate. The systems that had existed to move people through danger simply dissolved, as if they had never been there at all. And in a way, that was the point. MI9 did not end with a declaration. It ended with the absence of need. When borders reopened and uniforms returned to the roads, the discipline of vanishing lost its urgency. What had once been essential became unnecessary, and the work slipped back into the ordinary world without resistance. For those who had depended on it, this transition was not immediate. Even after liberation, habits remained. People still listened before speaking, still watched doors close a second longer than required, still hesitated before trusting a voice that sounded official. The war had taught them that safety was rarely announced. It had to be recognized quietly. Men who returned through the escape lines carried this awareness with them. Some resumed flying. Others did not. Many found that the distance they had crossed was not measured in miles, but in perception. They had learned how fragile movement could be, how much survival depended on decisions made slowly and without witnesses. Civilians returned to lives that looked unchanged from the outside. Houses stood where they had always stood. Shops reopened. Trains ran on time again. But inside these ordinary spaces, memories lingered that could not be shared easily. Silence, once practiced as protection, had become part of daily life. There were no official endings for these people. No moment when they were told it was safe to speak freely. Many never did. Not because they were afraid, but because speaking felt unnecessary. The work had been done without words. Remembering it aloud risked changing what it had been. History eventually caught up, slowly and incompletely. Archives opened. Lines were named. Numbers were estimated. The outlines of MI9's work emerged in fragments, stripped of the uncertainty and hesitation that had defined it. These accounts helped explain what had happened, but they could never fully capture how it felt to survive by remaining unseen. And perhaps they were never meant to. MI9 was not built to inspire in the usual sense. It offered no slogans, no examples meant for imitation. Its lessons were narrow, shaped by a war where visibility invited destruction and restraint preserved life. Outside that context, they resist easy translation. But some truths endure quietly. That not every act of courage announces itself. That survival is often collective, dependent on many small decisions rather than one great moment. That sometimes the most powerful response to violence is patience, and the refusal to be noticed. The escape lines did not alter the course of the war in ways that could be drawn on a map. They altered its human cost. Men returned who would otherwise have disappeared. Families remained intact because doors opened briefly and then closed again without record. Nothing marks these moments now. No monument stands where silence did its work. No plaque lists the names of those who chose not to ask questions. No date commemorates the night when waiting was the safest choice. But in the spaces where absence replaced loss, something remains. A reminder that history is shaped not only by what is seen and remembered, but by what passes through quietly, leaving no trace behind. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.